Alright guys, welcome back for another video on HAIKYU Fly High, and today we're going to do a quick comparison between V1 and also V2 version of Kenma because we have the Kenma rerun banner today. However, in 5 months time we're also going to be getting a second version. And as of right now, you're not able to play both versions together in the same team. So before you actually deciding to summon on V1, take a look at this video to ensure that it's still going to be the right decision for you. Okay. So as per usual, I have divided them into different categories for easier comparison. Okay. So starting off, we're actually going to be comparing their core mechanic, which is something very unique to each version of them. For V1, it's something called Fortify. For V2, it's something called Maintain. They're both on kind of like a stacking basis. So you need to perform certain actions in order to actually trigger those kind of in order to get those kind of buff stacks, and then you get basically different buffs based on how many stacks you have, and also obviously the more stacks you have, the bigger number of the buff, etc. Okay, so for V1, for Fortify, basically if you do not have SP hidden to V1, you can only get up to 10 stack. If you do actually have SP hidden to V1 as well, you can go up to 15 stack. So for 15 stacks, that's obviously going to be a bigger number, so that's kind of why I have them in the brackets, okay? But basically, the main thing this Fortified buff is able to provide is that per stack, you're able to get 1.5% reflex, and also if you actually are at skill rating 4, this can also do a debuff to the opponent, which is going to be 1.5% awareness debuff. Actually, no, I think it's like 1% awareness debuff and 2% strength debuff, but you get a certain bigger buff as well once you hit a certain threshold. Okay, now the main nice thing about this is actually the fact that this is actually going to be permanent on even when Kenma V1 is going to be subbed off, and this is very important because what that basically means is that you can have Kenma starting up in your lineup just for like 1 or 2 rallies, then afterwards you sub him off, and then you can get all of those really nice benefit for the remainder of the match. You know, just imagine you can get 15% reflex, 15% awareness debuff, and also 30% strength debuff for the entire duration of the match just by playing him for like 2 rallies. So that's kind of why it's one of the biggest advantage for him. Now, the unfortunate thing here is obviously right now in a game, you're not actually able to play 2 people with the same name. So even if you actually want to use him for like a, let's say a pinch server, we'll just have him on the core for a few rallies and then sub him off in order to benefit from this, you are still going to be doing it at the cost of not being able to play V2. Okay, so that's something you do have to bear in mind. Now let's look at the core mechanics for V2. I think it's something called Maintain. Basically per stack, you're able to get 10% awareness and reflex, and also when you consume that, you're also able to get a tiny bit of other buff as well, which I think I'll talk about later on in this video. But if you just take a look at the reflex number, what you realize is that even though I put the maximum here, which is going to be 60%, on average, you are probably going to be expecting to look about 20 or 30%, which is already going to be a lot higher than what V1 is able to provide. On top of that, you're also able to get an awareness buff, which V1 is not able to provide either. The only thing is missing here is obviously that you're not able to do a debuff on the opponent. And that can be potentially tricky depending on your team line, because maybe, for example, if you want to trigger SP Tanaka's memory, then you kind of need a way to inflict debuff on the opponent. So that's kind of the only thing V2 has, which does so V2 doesn't have, which V1 does, which is that kind of debuff mechanics. However, the main game-breaking aspect of this V2 mechanics or this maintain mechanic is actually the fact that you can force every single rally, you can force a bad receive into perfect, and that is game-breaking in my opinion. Purely because normally when you have a bad receive, you're almost guaranteed to be losing that point, okay? And this basically buy you a whole lifeline. And he can actually do this once per rally, which is absolutely insane. Now, this obviously does require you having that kind of buff stacks on him when you do that bad receive. So let's say if the enemy actually do a serve ace, then you won't be able to convert that if you don't have that already. If you don't have this maintain buff already at the start of rally. However, skill reason 2 kind of fix that and ensures that you're able to always do this, because at the end of each rally or at the start of each rally, you will be getting a guaranteed amount of maintain stats. So that basically means you can do even convert a bad serve receive into perfect as well. And also because you'll be guaranteed, I think, at least minimum 3 maintain buff, that basically already means you will be guaranteed at least 30% awareness and reflex as well, which once again is really nice number, especially comparing to what V1 is able to provide. Okay, so that's kind of the main difference between the two. Overall, I think V2's game mechanic is just a lot more broken. It's also able to offer much bigger numbers as well. So I would say V2 comfortably wins in this category. The only thing lacks is that debuff mechanics, but you can always find other teammates who are able to land debuff on the opponents as well if you do need that to happen. Okay. Next, we move on to the setting category. So for the setting category, the two are slightly different because for Kenma V1 is a skill 2, whereas for V2 is actually an ultimate attack. And that's why there's going to be a big difference in terms of multiply and also a small difference in terms of the net crossing cooldown. Okay, for V1, you're also able to get 80% awareness based on reflex. A lot of time that already means guaranteed crit because V1 can easily max out his own reflex. And then for the spiker, you're also able to improve the spiking multiply if he's actually at the back row. And also, if you are skill ranger 2, you're also able to give 100% strength buff as well. So those are all really, really nice buff he's able to provide. For V2, even though it has a cooldown of 8 net crossing because it's an ultimate attack, if you can actually get a perfect receipt, then when you actually set it, it's actually going to be guaranteed to crit and also 0 cooldown. So I guess you could actually say that because of this mechanism, you may actually see V2 spamming his setting a lot more than V1, even though it's actually an ultimate attack. And then as a result, basically V2 is going to have both a bigger number and also able to do it more frequently. On top of that, when the receive is not perfect, then the multiplier will actually increase by 200. So the 320 multiplier I have here is actually at the highest level. If you're able to get another 200 on top, that's going to be 520% multiplier, which is insanely high. It might be one of the highest setting multiplier as well in the game. So if you just compare the two here, what you realize is that in terms purely your setting power and also frequency, V2 is going to have the edge. However, V2 is not actually able to provide as much buff to the spiker. So from that perspective, you might be thinking V2 is kind of just buffing up himself a lot more. He does have ways to buff up other teammates, so I'll move on towards the end of the video in the last section. However, it's not going to be so much of an offensive buff to dedicated to the spiker. So it's really going to depend on what you're looking for. If you just want a stronger set and also some kind of like just bigger number with your settings, then V2 is obviously going to be the one having the edge here. However, if you're actually looking at this whole, also taking into consideration of the amount of buff you're able to provide for the spiker, then V1 is actually going to have a slight edge here. Okay, overall, I'll probably say the two are more or less the same. Then we move on to the other skill they will be able to have. For V1, that's actually going to be his set dump, which is actually his ultimate attack. This obviously have a high multiplier because it's an ultimate attack, and on top of that, it has a debuff ability of debuffing the enemy's next spike by 40% strength, which is actually really nice because normally you will only be using set dumps when your team has no other spiking ultimate, and this basically not only buy you a turn so that you still have a strong attack, but also actually have a nice debuff ability, which can potentially means the enemy won't be able to win that point straight away, and then that gives you a chance to then try to win that rally with your next spiking attack. Okay, so this is quite nice. And then for this one, for VT, it's going to be actually a receive attack, which is skill 2. It has a 200% multiplier, so it's not that high. However, you're also able to get a buff to both your set and also recover your own stamina. But then the most important thing is that if you do actually end up using him to receive, then your next back row receive, it's actually going to increase your multiplier by an whopping 200%, which is really, really strong. So once again, it's somewhat similar to V1 in the sense that ideally you probably don't actually want him to receive, just like you don't really want V1 to actually do a setter down. The reason why you don't want V2 to actually receive himself is because if you're actually receiving, then you can't actually be setting the ball because you can't have the same person touching the ball twice in a row. So that's kind of why a lot of time you don't actually want your setter to receive. However, if you do actually end up receiving, you're going to get a really, really nice buff afterwards as well, which kind of soften the blow, okay? So for this category, I'll probably say the two are more or less the same. They're both actions preferably you don't want to perform. However, if you do actually end up performing it, you do get some nice utility at the same time as well, okay? And then the last category is going to be just a bunch of other buffs they're able to provide. For V1, you're able to provide a permanent 16% reflex for your whole team, regardless of any condition. And even though this is quite nice, if you actually add up the 16% plus, let's say, the 15% you have here, in total, that's only going to be 30 or just over 30% reflex, which, to be honest, still going to be less than what V2 is able to provide. So this is not actually that big a number if you actually put this into, if you actually put this together to compare against V2. And another thing is that when your team just perform a block, which is not bad, you're able to reduce the enemy spike multiplier by 16%, which is actually really nice. You'll be able to trigger this a lot because it's not a bad block, etc. 16%, however, is not that high, especially because a lot of the spiking ultimate multiplier tend to go in the region of 300. So 16% reduction on that, it's not going to be that high, but it's just something you're able to trigger off constantly throughout the match. Then for V2, the other buff he's able to provide is able to provide himself with 15% set and also receive, and also your whole team with 40% spirit as skill resonance 2. And then furthermore, as skill resonance 4, when your team do a perfect set, those with receiving skill increase 40% power or quick attack stat for 2 necrosis. Across the whole, none of those buffs are like amazing either. 40% spirit is somewhat nice, but once again, I feel like it's not game-breaking numbers. And then the last thing is that 40% increase to power and quick stat. Normally, there are already loads of ways to increase in quick and also power attack stat, so the 40% is not going to be that high in comparison either. Furthermore, there is actually going to be a condition of you needing to have a receive skill as well, which may be easy or hard depending on how your team looks. But overall, I'll probably say the other buff section for both V1 and V2, they're just kind of nice to have, but they're not really game breaking. Okay. Okay, so that's a quick comparison between the two characters. Now, should you actually summon for V1 in this rerun banner, knowing that V2 will be coming out in 5 months' time? The honest answer is probably no, because if we just take a look at the various different categories, I personally think that setting them more or less the same. V2 is able to do more stronger sets himself. However, V1 is able to provide nicer buff to the spiker, so that's kind of like a bit of a tie there. Then for the secondary skill, set the dump versus receive, both are not ideal, but you're able to get better utility if you do actually end up using them. Then for the other buff section, both of them are pretty small buffs. They're not game breaking. They're kind of just nice to have, in my opinion. So to me, the bottom 3 categories are all more or less the same and not too much different. So the main game breaking or the main difference between the two, it's going to be really come down to the unique mechanics they're able to provide. However, for V1, whilst he's able to provide a huge amount of reflex, team AoE reflex, and that was like a really, really big thing when he first released, because no other character at that point was able to provide that much reflex buff. However, at this point in the game, knowing that the future character JP is going to release, especially with like SP Hiragami, he's also able to provide lots of reflex buff, and also opposite the case here as well. V2 is also able to arguably provide much better reflex buff and also awareness buff at the same time. The unique edge that V1 is able to provide is kind of no longer there. The only thing he has going for him is kind of this debuff ability, which I still think is quite unique. I don't actually know any other character off the top of my head which is able to debuff the enemy awareness and also strength at this number. So this is still really nice, and also consider the fact it's also going to be a permanent buff. However, in order for you to get over this, you need him to be a skill resonance 4, which is going to be really, really expensive. Whereas on the other hand, the mechanics that V2 is able to provide, converting bad receive into perfect ready, that is game breaking by itself. You are able to get this as skill resonance 1, no problem at all. Skill resonance 2 obviously makes ensure you can do this even for like bad self receive. However, even as skill resonance 1, you are already able to trigger this multiple times in a match, which is crazy, and that's like one of the most game-breaking mechanics in my opinion. Out of amongst all of the characters, we're not even talking about setters, but just among all of the characters, this is probably one of the most game-breaking mechanics in my opinion. So just from this perspective alone, I just think that V2 is going to have much bigger edge over V1, no matter how you look at it. Okay.